I usually vote. Well, I used to vote. But currently, the reason why I don't vote and I'm not gonna vote this time is not because of the inconvenience or anything like that. But I don't see anyone fit enough at the current moment to run the municipal, the current elections. And also, maybe if there were like individual candidates running and kungarani a party as a whole, like an individual candidate or Imelayete with no political influence or anything like that, as in like political party influence, then maybe we could vote because we have like a standalone person. We just need something new, need something different. That's why I believe, could see, I don't see the point of voting. Come on.
Um, why don't people want to vote, or at least are not motivated enough to vote? I think it's a distrust of the political system which we have. Um, we've had democracy for more than 27 years now, and in that time, the levels of inequality have soared to the worst in the world. We have the worst youth unemployment in the world. Um, and general service delivery for majority of South Africans has been subpar. A lot of the things that were promised at the dawn of democracy have never come to fruition. So people don't, a lot of people don't feel like there is enough incentive for them to vote. They don't see a reason to vote. How does voting help them?
Welcome to the After Freedom podcast, where we unpack the moves behind the movement of a generation dominated by social justice. I am your host, Robert Matanjwa, and with me, my co-host, Unam Joy. So for the next few weeks, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the many things that define our self-proclaimed activist generation and the impact those things have. So if you're an ordinary person who has absolutely no idea what the hashtags and infographics are about, this podcast is for you. If you're a politically engaged individual who wants to hear some new perspective, you've landed at the right spot. Basically, if you're a person who's keen to learn and isn't scared of new conversations, you are going to enjoy the coming weeks. Welcome everyone to the After Freedom podcast, where we unpack the moves behind the movement of a generation that is dominated by social justice. I am your host, Robert Matanjwa, and with me always my co-host, Unam Joy. Unam, how are you doing?
I'm doing relatively okay. Extreme emphasis on the relative.
So, in episode 1, we had a brief discussion about bringing more attention to African and South African issues into the mainframe of social media and all other medias that involve our communication. Today, we're going to be acting on that very same imperative by having a reflection into the history of our democracy, the whole 27 years, and how those determine how we should vote in the municipal elections that are coming within the next 2 days. And with us today, a very special guest that's going to help us do this. She's an honors student for philosophy, politics, and economics. She's also a history teacher, and she has a TikTok account with over 17,000 followers, and at the time of this recording, more than 250,000 likes. Our guest for today is Kaitlin Rawson. So, before we get started, Kaitlin, when I initially reached out to you for this interview, we were meant to record it a week ago. But personally, I'm glad we didn't record it a week ago because a lot went down for you last weekend on social media, particularly Twitter, and the very slanderous comments and suggestions that you were being paid by the good party to essentially slander the DA. So my question to you is, do you feel as if being someone who's involved in political commentary is an inherently dangerous thing? Because people really did come for you on that platform.
I don't think I necessarily consider it dangerous, but I am somewhat kind of cautious of what personal information I do put out there now, especially I'm very like aware of like not giving any like specific details about like the area that I live in or anything like that, just because you never know kind of what people who are out there are going to do, like especially when they are having such like aggressive and like sometimes even like violent reactions to what you're saying, even if it just is like online. So yeah, I don't necessarily consider it like dangerous, but I am cautious.
Yeah, no, we get you. And again, I think everyone is just taking it very, very personally and taking it very far, because this year is honestly an unprecedented year, because the general trend is that when we get around election times or when we're in an election year, political parties are in their best behavior. But there have been so many things that have happened this year that showed the true nature of the political in South Africa. So from just the civil unrest, the arrest of Jacob Zuma, and everything else that happened this year, what do you think led to this year being as major as it is?
I think it has to do a lot with the pandemic. I think we like kind of forget sometimes that this has been like almost like a global trauma that we've all gone through, in the sense that it's like caused such a disruption to everyone's lives, and it's made people kind of have to change the way they live, the way they go about things, even just like their day-to-day like lives. And I think that's had more of an impact sometimes than we realize. And I think sometimes as well, like people think like, oh, like the pandemic like happened like in 2020, and don't realize that even though like in like this year it's been somewhat better in the sense that we've like come out of like some of the harshest restrictions, it's still like the impact of lockdowns, and like even the one that we had earlier this year when we had to go back up to, I think it was level 4 we went back up to, these all like have like a compounding effect as well, and it kind of just all like these small things add on top of each other, and then it makes like the tiniest little thing that much more explosive. And I think as a result, people have gotten frustrated and they want to air that frustration in whatever way they can.
So, Kaitlin, with the events that transpired in July here in KZN and in some parts of Gauteng, it has been very clear that a catalyst to that violence and the looting and the unrest that occurred was the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma. And, you know, with him being a political figure, you know, it was quite interesting to see how that influenced the reality of many people. So how do you therefore think the current political landscape of South Africa shapes the social interactions that we have with each other?
Well, I think it makes everything like a lot more difficult, because like you said, the arrest of Jacob Zuma was like the catalyst for the violence, but it wasn't like that was like it wasn't that was the only factor, and we're dealing with a lot of poverty, inequality, a lot of like really like terrible like social and socioeconomic issues in the country. And I feel like that has like undoubtedly shaped the way that we interact with each other, and caused a lot more, because there's kind of so much pain and suffering because of these socioeconomic issues. People are like more willing to lash out. People are less likely to kind of act in a way where they give someone else the benefit of the doubt, almost.
Yeah, I completely get you there. And I think the thing is, for the longest time ever, we've spent so much time just running and doing so many different things with our time and our days, that when the pandemic hit, it made everyone sit down. Not even slow down, it made everyone sit down. You had to sit at home and generally introspect about so many different things. And I think that it also made a lot of people do some thinking about the political state of our nation. Because now more than ever, a lot of people, or most people, are politically engaged with South Africa very differently. You know, you can't be apolitical anymore, because you know that on a given day, you have to sit down and listen to the president of the country at 8 p.m. tell you how your next day is going to be and what you're going to be able to do for the next month or so. For school children, they had to sit down and engage with the political head of state about whether or not they were going to be able to go back to school and, I don't know, maybe complete their matric within that given year. So do you think the pandemic has had that kind of political impact on us and everything that's gone down?
Yeah, I definitely do think so. And I think you're 100% right that like there is this like increase in like political engagement, even just for like myself. Like I'm someone who's like been studying politics for the last like 4 years, and like this year and last year have really been the time that I've been most politically engaged in my life. So I do think like that there's these people have more time, like you said, to sit and reflect and think about all these things. And I think that because we are now like in that state where it's like so much more politically like engaged and people are wanting to share their opinions, also like especially like political engagement online, like because we haven't been able to interact with each other in person, you go to the internet, you go to Twitter, you go to TikTok, you go to whatever platform that you use in order to share your views and your opinions. And I think the impact of that has been major in terms of the way that, especially then because like all these interactions are happening online, people are so much bolder online. It's not like these are not things that someone would say to their friends and family when they're sitting around like the dinner table, like having a conversation at like a braai or something. These are things that like they feel emboldened to say because they are online using anonymous accounts half the time, and they feel like there's no repercussions for their words, and they feel like this is their chance to kind of air out their frustrations because they're so much more like aware and engaged and of what's going on.
So with having been, mainly an activist on social media, namely TikTok, because you're very active on your TikTok account, when we were scrolling through it, we were looking at some of the things you were saying and we're like, this woman is so brave and she has the intellectual capacity to dissect some of the issues that, sometimes we have difficulty understanding. But in that bravery, we see that you get a lot of hate, and just like you get bashed a lot on the internet for saying things that are objectively true. So my question is, how do you therefore deal with the social media negativity that comes with being an activist on social media?
Yeah, so it's been something that I've had to kind of adjust to and deal with. Luckily, my account hasn't been one that's like blown up super quickly or anything. I've been doing this for a couple of months now, and the hate has kind of increased as I've grown. So I've had time to kind of adjust to it, and I haven't been like just like all at once like thrown into these like hectic situations where I'm like having like a barrage of hate at me. And I think I've learned to kind of like adapt and cope with it quite well, especially because I know that when I'm putting something on my TikTok account, it's because it's something that I feel needs to be said and it's something that I believe in. So I'm not going to let kind of someone else's opinion of me change that view of mine or change that perspective of mine, because I know the stuff that I'm putting out there, it's like strongly based in my like values and my morals, and it's also well researched. Like I've done the research, I know what I'm talking about. So there's, for most of, especially the more kind of controversial topics that I do speak about that kind of attract the most hate, I know that I'm confident in my message and I'm confident in what I'm saying. And while there is a certain thing to be said for being open to constructive criticism, I'm not going to allow the fact that someone hates me for what I've said detract from my own beliefs.
And I think the insane thing about everything that's going on right now is that all of it is happening in a social media space, essentially. We're doing our activism in a social media space. A lot of the campaigning for the political parties is also happening in a social media space. So now we have to have the real conversation of how do we translate all of the energy that's happening in social media to real life, which is obviously for us normal citizens, converting our political beliefs into ballots and who we're going to vote for. So, and I see something really interesting in your TikTok here where you posted a video about why your ideological beliefs are more in line with the economic freedom fighters, but you're going to be voting good these elections because you feel as if they would do what's best for your municipal area. So what I want to know is what goes behind the calculus or the decision-making process of this is who I'm going to vote for. And more importantly, why should I vote in the first place?
So for me, I think like voting is like one of the most like simple and like effective things that you can do to like just be an active like citizen and an active participant in your democracy. So I think like the very least thing that I can do is vote, and then from that, the best thing that I can do with regards to voting is actually make an informed decision and know the party that I'm voting for and the values and the principles that they represent. And in terms of deciding who to vote for, it was actually quite a difficult decision for me this year. It's something that I've deliberated over a lot. And like, even just when I say that, like, the EFF was a party that I strongly considered voting for, like, that gets a ton of hate online. There's so many people that immediately then just say, like, oh, like, I'll write off everything that you have to say, because how could you say something that you would, like, consider voting for the EFF? And the reasons why that I've considered, like, voting for the EFF are because, like you said, like, ideologically, I do think they align with me. I do think that we need to have more, like, effective state institutions, more social welfare programs. I think we need to do a better job of looking after the poor in this country, the unemployed in this country. And I think the EFF's message is one that is in line with that. I'm someone who I don't necessarily believe that the free market is the solution to everything, as some other political parties like DA and Action SA, they parties that I wouldn't really ever really consider voting for, because they are so orientated on the free market is what will solve all our problems. And fundamentally, I have that sort of disagreement. So that is why for me, EFF is a better option in terms of my beliefs based on what I know about economics, what I know about politics, and what I know about social welfare, especially. But that being said, there are a lot of things that I do find incredibly problematic about the EFF. I think some of the things that Julius Malema says, although they may be great in kind of bringing attention to the EFF, they're not necessarily the best for creating kind of like a unified country and a unified like movement behind him, in terms of incorporating everyone within the country. I also, as a woman in particular, I have issue with some of the misogyny that I've seen from the EFF. There's been kind of incidents that I've looked at with EFF MPs and things they've said that I've found questionable. The instance also when EFF MPs voted against pro-LGBTQ plus legislation in Parliament. That's something that concerns me, because even though they were kind of, the party did say that was not what their policies were, not what they wanted their MPs to represent, the MPs still voted in that way. So that is something to take into consideration. It is something that's concerning. So those are kind of more so the things that have steered me away from voting for the EFF in this election. And I feel like the party that I am going to be voting for is the Good Party. And I feel like they are a really solid option for a municipal election, because they're a party that I don't necessarily see the same sort of problems as I see with the EFF in terms of kind of the things that I've just mentioned. They are a party that is more kind of orientated towards free market solutions, not as much as parties like the DA or EFF, but they aren't kind of as left-leaning as the EFF. So that is why on a national election level, where those sorts of like broader economic policies would have the potential to be implemented by their MPs, I would have second thoughts about voting for Good. But I do think their mandate in terms of wanting to provide service delivery to all of the people in a municipality, not just the privileged people in that municipality, I think that is something commendable from them. I really appreciate the way that they've emphasized spatial justice in their campaign, especially because they are party based out of the Western Cape, and we know that spatial inequality as a result of apartheid spatial planning is something that's a huge issue there, and something that the DA there has completely failed to address. So I think that the Good Party will be able to provide good service on a municipal level. It's just because I ideologically have some of those disagreements with them that I would have to think twice about voting for a party like the Good Party on a national level.
So, I think I find it very interesting that you're able to draw distinctions between, okay, cool, I can align with this party, but specifically for these elections, I'm not going to vote for them for 1, 2, 3 reasons. I think that's an impeccable skill to have. But a question I want to ask here is, I've made an unconscious observation and I've found that a lot of people are a little apprehensive about voting in municipal elections, because the question is, if I vote for party A in the municipal elections and hypothetically speaking they win, however in the national elections party B wins, which is not the party that I wanted, it is highly likely that the budget allocations are not going to be focused on my area because I haven't voted for party B, which is now, in charge of pretty much everything. So in that regard, why does it therefore still become necessary for us to vote in municipal elections? Like, what's the point essentially of voting during municipal elections?
So I think voting on a municipal level is still important, because even though there are kind of limitations to municipal power, especially when like the party that is in charge of your municipality isn't in charge on a provincial or national level, there can be those kind of limitations. I still do think that it's important because municipalities can affect like significant change in the things, like the aspects of politics that affect you on a very day-to-day basis. So things like the rubbish collection in your area, things like the water, the electricity to your area. These are things that your municipal elections really are going to have huge implications for. And also things like bylaws and stuff, like the bylaws that get instituted in your municipality. And we saw this with the bylaws that were recently implemented in the city of Cape Town under the DA. You have to really strongly consider that if you don't vote, there's more influence for parties that may be implementing bylaws that you fundamentally would disagree with. So you need to vote for a party that is going to represent your values and push back against those bylaws. Even if you vote for a party that doesn't necessarily win the majority, if they have a seat on that council in your metro, in your municipality, that can make a difference. One seat in that municipality can be the difference between a bylaw getting enacted or a bylaw not getting enacted. It can be the difference between good service delivery in your area and bad service delivery in your area. So even though there are limitations, I feel like it's a very defeatist attitude to say, well, it's never going to be perfect, so why even bother? Rather, do what you can to get the people that you think are going to be able to serve you best into those positions that you want to see them.
In my personal opinion, I think that every single vote is a compromise because no two people are alike. And by consequence of that, no political party can adequately represent everything that you believe in. So whenever you head to the polls to vote, there's always going to be some kind of compromise that's made. But what a lot of people have issues with, and this is translating to a more practical essence, it is to say that a lot of political parties write things in their manifestos and present certain ideas in their campaigns, but those ideas don't necessarily translate into reality. The ANC has beautiful manifestos that represent the nation that we wish to have. However, for decades, we have been witness to their corruption. We've been witness to their violence, and so many things have gone wrong there. The EFF is a radical party that's for the people. However, they've been embroiled in corruption, particularly with the VBS Mutual Bank, and the DA has similar issues as well. So what a lot of people feel like is, I'm just not going to read these manifestos, or none of these are important, because all of these people enter this field with a self-interest of getting rich or stealing from the country. Therefore, I'd rather not vote. Or if I am going to vote, I'd rather vote for the devil I know. Therefore, I'm just going to cast a vote for the ANC because we're already used to it. So my question is, as ordinary citizens or as people, how do you strike that balance of considering the practicality and the history of a political party, as well as their ideological beliefs? And how do you weigh those two up to make an accurate decision when you're voting? Because I think you make an excellent example of how the EFF has great political beliefs. However, you disagree with some of the things that their MPs have said or some of the things that they voted on. So what goes into the decision-making process of how am I going to weigh these things up and how will they influence how I vote?
Yeah, I think it's about kind of firstly being like sharing your own values and what your beliefs are, because you can't vote for a party that's supposed to represent your beliefs if you don't know what those beliefs are. And I think people like firstly need to be educated on like politics and what sort of policies mean what and what sort of ideas these parties are actually putting out there, more than just the surface level of like, oh, we're going to make your life better. So I think like being informed in that aspect is firstly crucial, so that these voters actually are aware of what they're voting on. And then secondly, in terms of that balance of between like, like the promises versus action, I think sometimes it's very difficult because a lot of these parties like that we have in South Africa are much smaller parties who only have a few seats in parliament. They haven't had control over many municipalities or any municipalities in some cases. So it's almost as if like, it's like, okay, this is a party that I think, has good values and I would like to see these policies implemented, but you almost have to take that leap of faith in voting for them to see if they would actually deliver. Whereas the parties like the ANC, the DA, and to a certain extent the EFF, which have been in government and you can see their track record, that then it becomes much more a thing of, well, weighing up, well, this is what the parties have said, this is what the parties have done, have they delivered on that? And I don't think necessarily it's always about completely writing off a party because, oh, they said one thing and they didn't deliver on that, or they didn't deliver completely on that aspect. Because what people can sometimes forget is politics is not straightforward. And even for a party in power, there are limitations to what they can just, enact. There are still other members of parliament. There are still other parties in parliament. There's financial, there's budget constraints. Like, the parties can't necessarily always do everything that they want to do. And I think, obviously, like, the ANC gets a lot of flack for not delivering on their promises. And I do believe that it is important to hold parties accountable to, like, okay, you said you were going to do this, why has it not been done? But I also think that, and like obviously corruption in the ANC, we know that that's a huge issue and that they are struggling to deal with the corruption that is in the ANC. But I do sometimes feel like people almost get too vitriolic in their hatred for the ANC, and they kind of forget that it's like the ANC has achieved things in their time in governance. And like, I have quite a problem with the narrative that's like, oh, like, as long as it's not the ANC. And so many people, like, especially in my TikTok comments, I'm not sure if it's just my demographic of people that I appeal to, but there is so much like comments along the lines of like, anything to get the ANC out of power. The ANC is the worst party. They cannot be in government anymore. We can't trust the ANC. And it's like, okay, like, yes, the ANC has some like major problems, but if you compare them to like, in terms of like what they represent, their policies, I actually think the ANC has some really great policies. And if they could actually, get themselves together as a party and as a government and, actually manage to like cut down on the corruption, stamp out the corruption, and provide that policies, these like their manifesto promises, they would actually be a really good option. And I feel like people are sometimes far too quick to just judge the ANC for what they haven't achieved and forget to reflect on, well, this is what they have,
Yeah, I think we can all make concessions that, the ANC or any party anywhere, that's been ruling can have, it's not mutually exclusive for them to be corrupt, but equally having done pretty questionable, some pretty remarkable work, some pretty applaudable work, and I think that's the same thing that exists with the ANC. But what I want us to look at now is the fact that I think for these elections, a lot of people have decided to run independently, right? And we're just going to have to put in the faith, and they have put in the faith into just them running independently and ultimately hoping that they win. So we've already touched on, how things would be allocated in the event that, one party that is leading one area hasn't won the municipal elections, however, has won nationally and vice versa. So if a person runs independently, given the fact that there's so many parties and there's so many people running independently now, how practical is it for us to vote for a much smaller party or a person who's running independently, especially given the fact that, these big parties have so much more influence? So how much power do they actually have to enact some sort of change? And how practical is it for us to vote for someone who's running independently? Yeah.
So I think at the moment, obviously voting for independence isn't going to be it's not going to be the easiest thing for these independents if they manage to come into power, because of we are at the moment such a party-dominated system. But we also have to consider that this is the first election that independents can actually contest. 2024 is the first time we're going to be able to see independents for presidential candidates. So I feel like it's also a situation where you have to give, if you believe that this independent candidate is going to be able to, if you believe in their values, their vision and their mandate, and you believe that they actually would be able to deliver on that, you have to put a little bit of faith in them so we can start seeing that change in the system. Because if you just say, okay, I'm not going to vote for an independent candidate because they're not going to be able to get anything done, then we remain with the party system as we have it, where our elections are dominated by political parties. But if you put that modicum of faith and say, look, I know that maybe in this elections, if this independent candidate that I like achieves power, they might have a lot of difficulties that they face in actually achieving what they set out to achieve, but I'm still going to put my faith in them and I'm still going to vote for them because it's something that I believe in. You can then start to see that, yes, they might have difficulties this time, but next time, maybe there's even more independent candidates. Maybe there's a less focus on the parties and political parties, and we can start to see that change of more of that direct mandate in terms of accountability to constituents and citizens rather than to parties.
Exactly, and I completely agree with you in that. And I think the one place where I wanted to bring this conversation back is the fact that everything that's happening right now is a culmination of years, in fact, decades of political decisions that were made in South Africa, but also personal decisions that were made by politicians. I recently read a statistic that said from 2014 to 2019, we've lost 1.5 trillion rands to corruption. Not since 1994, not since the beginning of the new millennium, not since the beginning of the new decade. In the last 5 years, before the pandemic, we lost 1.5 trillion rands to corruption. And I think when you think of it that way, that's how you begin to see corruption as a violent crime. Because more than 30 million South African citizens live below the upper bound poverty line. And that 1.5 trillion rand is being stolen, is being looted, and is being misused. And there are people who are genuinely dying from poverty, from not having homes, from so many different things, even poor healthcare. Because that money is being taken and being used for people for personal reasons, for reasons that it was not intended for. And that in and of itself has to be considered theft. So for me, it's how do you balance that with all of the great stuff that's happened in the past 27 years as well? Me being able to have the platform that I currently have is something that is a direct consequence of democracy and aggressive policy to make sure that I get that democracy. The fact that I'm able to sit in the same classrooms or access the same facilities as my white counterparts is equally something that is a consequence of aggressive democratic policies. And that's never something that I want to take away from our system. And the sheer fact that transitioning into a democracy looked better for South Africa than so many other nations, not just on the continent, but literally all over the globe. So I think there's a lot of positive that comes with our democracy. But how do you balance those extremes out to come up with a comprehensive understanding of South African history, a perspective of South African history? Because politically, a lot has been given to the nation, but to equal proportions, a lot has been taken from the citizens as well. And when I say this, I don't only want to mention, the ANC did this, whatever, because realistically speaking, the policies that we see are not a result of only the ANC. They're a result of parliamentary decisions that are inclusive of every single political party in the nation. Well, okay, not every single party, but the parties that do exist in parliament. So that's including your DA, that's including your EFF, that's including your COPE and Inkatha Freedom Party. It's including all of those political parties. And I think it's just very difficult to come up with a comprehensive understanding of our democracy looking at the situation that way.
Yeah, I think it's such a difficult thing, and it's like, it reminds you that we have to approach these conversations with nuance, because you can't just say, like characterize it in one word or even one sentence. Like, it's, like you said, there's the benefits, the things that the ANC has brought to this country since 94 that have really changed the lives of a lot of people in this country, in fact, the majority of people in this country. But at the same time, the corruption has robbed people of so many opportunities, so many advantages that they could be having. So I think that dichotomy is something that we have to kind of sit with and reflect with as South Africans. But I also just think, like, for myself as a white South African, I think we also need to acknowledge that corruption in South Africa did not start in 1994. Corruption has a much longer legacy than that. And we, as white South Africans, we have to take accountability for the fact that corruption started with our ancestors, and the system that they set up was a system that was designed to be corrupt. And this is not to take accountability away from the people who are actually enacting the corruption right now and benefiting from the corruption right now, because they are the problem as well. But we have to acknowledge that they inherited a system that made was the perfect environment for corruption to take place. The way that the entire political system was set up, and the way that, especially because we see this issue with like corruption in government contracts and who gets the tenders, who gets the government contracts. And the reason why it's so easy for people today and people in government today to set up these fraudulent, these corrupt deals and tenders was because that was how it operated during apartheid, and that was the system that they inherited. And we have to reflect on that and acknowledge that this is not just a problem that started in 94. This is a problem that South Africa has been facing for a much longer time than that, and it's a problem that needs addressing. But we can't just put all the blame on one party. We can't just put all the blame on the ANC. Like, yes, of course, they must take accountability for the corruption that they have facilitated and enacted, but we need to look at the picture in a more nuanced way.
So, yeah, I find it interesting that you talk about that, but, I'm just going to draw a little bit of a tangent here, but, we're just going to go for it. When I make a comparison between the looting that occurred, and I know that, different sort of, different political landscapes require and will result in different engagement. And I understand that these issues that I'm about to reference are definitely much, much bigger in terms of like how long they spanned and how much more violent they were than what happened with the looting in July. However, I just want us to comment a little bit on the lack of international engagement with the issues that happened in July, right? So, for example, if we were to compare it, and once again, this is not to downplay what happened, with Black Lives Matter. If we were to compare it to Black Lives Matter, this is not to say that those are the same issues, but to see the lack of political and international engagement with what happened in South Africa during that time, I'm just wondering how that reflects on the political landscape on an international basis of South Africa, right? Because here, I'm not just talking about like BBC or CNN, sorry, commenting on what's happening in South Africa, because I know that there are some, news outlets that said a few things, like Al Jazeera, there was some information there. But even that was a little faulty. So how does that therefore reflect on the political engagement that international countries have with one another, and how we prioritize certain issues of certain nations over the issues of other nations? Yeah. How does that work?
I think it kind of reflects the very like Eurocentric Western nature of like international media. The fact that like the reason we hear about Palestine is because the US has vested interests there in their relationship with Israel. Like, that's the reason we hear about what's going on in Palestine. Like, it's not because, like, necessarily, like, Palestine is, like, more likely to get attention than South Africa for any other reason. The thing is like the Western kind of cultural hegemony doesn't have a vested interest in knowing what's going on in South Africa. And there was like some international coverage of what happened. I saw a couple of like articles on like CNN and stuff, but you're right, there wasn't like the mass kind of cultural awareness of what was going on. And I think the reason that we know about Black Lives Matter in America is because all the media that we consume here in South Africa is American. Like, a lot of the media that we consume here is that Western American lens. And I feel like that's something that we need to kind of start to challenge and start to say. It's like, okay, well, why are we getting so much of our information from like American media? And it's actually one of the reasons why I decided to really like start and focus on making political content on TikTok that's specifically related to South Africa. Because when I started my TikTok, like there was almost kind of the choice of like, well, am I going to cover like what's happening like in America? Am I going to talk about all these things that are happening internationally? And I decided, no, I'm going to just focus and make this purely about South Africa and South African politics.
Exactly. And for me personally, I did see a reasonable amount of international coverage for this issue. However, even that international coverage was incredibly one-dimensional, and they didn't take into consideration all of the factors that needed to be there. It seemed as if it was written to be of a very particular narrative that I didn't necessarily agree with. So for me, it's more than just creating South African content, but it's creating robust and nuanced South African content about our own issues in a way that's incredibly necessary, because that's not something that we're seeing a lot of the time. And the reason why I point out how one-dimensional it was is the fact that what I learned after this entire situation is that no one was completely right in how they interpreted it, but I think there was a shred of truth in something that all of us said. I think that there were people who were there protesting with very malicious intentions. They were there for the sole purpose of causing destruction and hurting other people, and even murdering, in fact. I think there were people who were there because they supported Zuma. I think there were people who were there, and most importantly, there were people who were there simply because they are in poverty. They are struggling. We watched the national address with Cyril Ramaphosa, and in the backdrop was the looting at, I think, the Queensburg Mall. It's very close to the rest where I live. And in the back, I could see children walking with bare feet, taking things out of that mall. And that shows you that more than just malicious intent, more than just people who are opportunistic, it also consisted of people who needed everything that they were taking. It consisted of people who have been incredibly disenfranchised by decades of poverty, decades of economic policy that did absolutely nothing but throw them under the bus. People who were disadvantaged by retrenchment as a consequence of restrictions due to COVID-19. And I think once you get to see all of those dimensions, then you get to see the reality that protest had, which is a multifaceted and multidimensional approach. So one of the things that I didn't hear get spoken about as often as I think it should was something that even your followers are still a bit touched over. And I noticed that because I've been in the comment section of some of your videos, which is essentially everything that went down in Phoenix, because that was truly a tragic and awful situation that I don't intend on letting escape my mind anytime soon. And just looking at that situation, it highlights something that we spoke about in episode 1, which is the fact that conflict between non-white people is a real thing that people are ignoring. For people like myself or Nonam, that's nothing new because we've been to schools that are predominantly Indian. We've been attending those schools our entire lives, and there has been real cases where we've had to defend our blackness repeatedly. And I think that's not something that's new, and it's something that happens for us regularly. So I can't begin to explain the level of anger and frustration that came over me when I saw the Phoenix posters, the DA posters in Phoenix that read, the ANC calls you racist, but the DA calls you heroes. I was bewildered. I was frustrated, but fundamentally I was disgusted at what I was seeing.
Just for anyone who doesn't know, there was a poster that, the DA had out that said the ANC calls you criminals, we call you heroes, right? Oh, if I'm not mistaken, it was something along those lines, right? And I was having a conversation with my dad, and I think he brought some perspective. This isn't something that he necessarily is in alignment with, but something he said to me was, sometimes it's important to look at the intention behind a whatever political statement people make. Now he understand, and he acknowledges the fact that the DA has people who are definitely out there to make sure that statements aren't bashful and aren't received in the wrong manner publicly. However, it's important for us to look at intention. So what is the intention behind that poster? Especially because we've heard conversations and, people's opinions being like, well, the media can twist stories and the media can, redirect a narrative. Perhaps the DA was only meaning it in a way that, people were protecting their homes and therefore we called those people heroes. And, people were protecting their property and therefore we call those people heroes. So then what would be your commentary on people who have that sort of perspective and who believe in that opinion that, the DA was declaring a sort of heroic belief or sort of heroic response to what was happening everywhere, essentially in KZN?
From my perspective, I can understand that the DA likely, and from what they've said, they didn't intend to call the people who killed people in Phoenix heroes. That wasn't the message that they were trying to send. They were, like you said, trying to portray the people that were actually, defending their property in a lawful way to be heroic. However, this is why I say that it's not an issue that should be spoken about in posters, because it doesn't matter that that was the DA's intention and that was the message that they were intending to put out there. The message that they put out there is that the actions of people who murdered other people are heroic, because that is the interpretation that not just some people but a lot of people got from the posters, especially when you see it kind of like a first impression of these posters and you think, okay, well, I wonder what that means. It's like, well, there's yes, you can, if you think about it, see like, okay, they probably mean this, but you shouldn't have to say, okay, well, I wonder what they actually mean, or like, what do they probably like mean by this? The message, like, again, it's not something that you can convey in a poster. And if they want to say, look, we appreciate the people who lawfully defended their communities, we appreciate the people who, you know, raised money to get food to people who couldn't get food during this time, or the people that were helping people fill up with fuel at fuel stations, like, yeah, those were all heroic actions that took place in KZN during that time. But don't put it on a poster saying the ANC called you racists and the DA called you heroes, because that's not the message you're conveying with that poster, and it's never going to end well. And what we saw happened was that they just ended up sowing racial tension, and it brought up a lot of the unresolved racial tension from that July unrest, and even from like the racial tension that's always existed. And yeah, I think the DA should have had the foresight, like, to know this is a political party that is supposedly made up of intelligent people that are, you know, they have teams that are there to do political communication, brand messaging, those sorts of things. They should have known, they should have had the foresight to know our message is not going to be interpreted well with these posters. And that's why I believe that they did know that the message was not going to be interpreted well with those posters. And I think they did it anyway, because like the DA, the way the direction that the DA has been going has been very much more so to attract those former VF plus type voters. And I think that was their intention. And I mean, even there was the statement from the person who was responsible for the posters, Dean McPherson. He said, there was like reports of him saying in one of the DA's internal meetings that we can afford to lose 50% of the black vote in KZN, but we can't afford to lose the Indian vote in KZN. So I feel like they knew what they were doing with those posters, and they decided it was worth it to them.
And for me, the reason why I genuinely believe that it was intentional is because if you intend to refer to two different acts or two different groups, and I say this because I genuinely believe that the people who went out with the intention of protecting their community from opportunistic, violent, and generally evil people are very different from the people who went out with the intention of murdering black people. I think those are two different groups entirely. When you make a poster to group both of them together, you are intending for something to happen. You are suggesting something by doing that entirely. And for me, what frustrated me about the entire situation was the reaction that came after it. I think, and this may be a controversial opinion, but once you go through something like that, there are videos out there of black people being brutalized in those streets, being treated in ways that are absolutely inhumane, in ways that we cannot tolerate under any circumstances. Once you go through that, the murder of nearly 40 people, the conversation after that must never be, let's reunite, or let's talk about unity, let's, throw, racism or whatever. No, that's not the conversation after that. After that, there need to be arrests. There need to be full-length investigations, and there needs to be genuine accountability. Because when we don't do that, when we don't remove those people from those communities, we create the idea that those people are representative of that entire community. And I strongly don't think that the entire community of Phoenix is racist. I have attended tournaments there. I've been there for all of my high school life, and some of my best friends live there. I don't think that that's a racist community. But when we picture people defending those incredibly horrendous acts and there's no accountability for anything that went down, then we create that perception that those acts and everything that went down is a reflection of that community. You cannot foster any unity, any genuine unity, if you do that. And that's nothing new. That's absolutely nothing new. Because even after apartheid, our first step towards unity was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which had the entire job of sweeping horrendous atrocities under the carpet and trying to say, all right, cool, let's reunite, which should never be the case. I'm not a person that's against unity. I'm not a person that's against doing away with racism. God knows my life would be better without it. But what I'm saying is, in the absence of accountability, unity is never going to happen. Unity is contingent on accountability happening. And I think that's still a thread that was missed in everything that happened, particularly because there was accountability for people who looted. There were houses, there were shacks that were being broken down by police officers to steal food from people who took it, to steal phones, to steal so many other things from people who looted. So my question is taking things back from those people more important than creating that accountability for people who needed to be held accountable for murder? On your priority list, is getting back the stolen iPhone 12 Pro Max more important than arresting someone who killed an innocent individual? That can't be the case. That's just my opinion. So my question to you would then be, how do you think we can start approaching racial conflicts or soothing racial tensions in South Africa, given how horrible, and I'm going to be honest here, I think that the TRC had a job to do. I understand that it was a product of the CODESA negotiations that were also about compromising to get us to the place that we are. But assessing it in exclusivity, it was a failure in creating any reconciliation in the country. So then my question becomes, how do we start to properly address racial tensions in South Africa when we have a historical failure to do so?
Yeah, I think you're 100% right that there needs to be accountability as the first step, and people need to face the repercussions of their racism. And if you are being racist, we can't just go immediately from, oh, like I was being racist yesterday and today like everyone should be happy and we should all be a united country, because no, then you're going to have that resentment that's simmering under the surface, because the people that were affected by that racism are going to know, well, no one actually faced accountability for what they did. I've just been expected to move on, and this person has just got to move on. And that's not how we should be approaching it. So I 100% agree with you there. And I think we also, like, I hate to like sound like I'm like beating a dead horse here, but it comes back to nuance as well. And we need to have like nuance and understanding of, like, we can acknowledge that multiple things can be true at once. And we can acknowledge that there were some people that acted in a racist and violent manner in Phoenix. And we can acknowledge that there are a lot of people that have acted in a racist manner in defending those actions. However, we can also acknowledge that that is not representative of an entire community. It's not representative of an entire race. And that there are many people, probably from Phoenix, many Indian people, who would be just as quick to condemn what happened as anyone of any other racial group or anyone from any other community. And it's holding the people that are responsible accountable and making sure that your kind of like implicit biases and the people that are maybe not going out there and committing murder but defending murder and saying, well, but they were afraid for their lives and that's why they went out to someone else's house and to someone else's streets and murdered someone. Like, we need to hold those people accountable as well, because it's not just the people who actually committed the violent actions, it's the people that make excuses and defend it, while also acknowledging that, well, that's not everyone. Not everyone is committing murder. Not everyone is defending the murderers. And we need to have that balanced perspective.
Yeah, and I think a perspective that is important to have here is the fact that you have choice, and I think the existence of the vote and the ability for us to vote, especially in a country like South Africa, embodies that idea of choice and the importance of choice, right? So whether you're a political party or not, you have the choice to be racist, you have the choice not to be racist, you have the choice to cater to a specific demographic. So a trend, very stereotypical trend that we would see, for example, with the EFF and the DA, is that the EFF very explicitly says that their main interest is to cater to the Black demographic. And with what you just said right now, with the DA or certain parties saying that they can afford to lose a black vote, that all speaks to the idea of choice, the choices that political parties make. They have the choice to uphold their own manifesto. And I think it's very interesting and very telling when a political party comes up with a manifesto but isn't able to fulfill their own manifesto, right? Because nobody is putting a gun to your head and saying, hey, you have to say this. So the fact that they make a choice to say certain things but therefore not uphold those things is very telling of the current political landscape that exists in South Africa. But yeah, I think essentially what today's podcast is about is just the very tricky political landscape of South Africa currently, and what is it that we can inherit, and what is it that we are going to receive from the vote, and just like these municipal elections. So what is there to look forward to? Why should we care? And I would just like to say thank you very much to Kaitlin for coming on here and dazzling us with her intellectual perspective and critique on the current political landscape of South Africa, and we highly appreciate that. I also think that Semiso and myself would like for people to take away this idea of choice and why it's important for you to vote, right? Like I said, the vote embodies an idea of choice that has been fought for in South Africa for a very long time and, very tirelessly. So, yeah. I think another thing that we can take into consideration is that we like to complain. We like to complain and we like to, point fingers. However, if you have the ability, meaning if you're 18 and above, you have the ability to vote. Therefore, complaining in and of itself is not enough. It's not inherently wrong. However, it's not enough just to complain. We need to enact some sort of change. We need to be responsible citizens and put those complaints to action. So, thank you, Kaitlin.
Alright, and that brings us to the end of the episode. We hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you for that conversation, Kaitlin. It was a really fun and engaging one. Don't forget to follow her on Instagram and TikTok at by Kaitlin Rawson. Believe me, her content will change your outlook on this country. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook at After Freedom SA. Follow me on Instagram at Rob Matanjwa. Follow Nam at u.nam.m. Again, do not ask me where the username comes from. And don't be scared to interact with us. Tell us what you think about the show. Tell us what we should talk about next time and what you think we can do to improve the show. And that is it from me. Robert Matanjwa signing out. We'll see you next time.